Joseph Stalin, a man of steel, the tough, totalitarian Soviet dictator, the epitome of Russian strength and authority in the 20th century. I mean, just look at that stash. That's the mustache of a guy who tells people what to do. But rewind back to the start, and little Joseph doesn't look so tough. And he's distinctly mustacheless. This is the kind of guy the other Stalin would beat up and steal lunch money from. He isn't even Russian. Wait, what? Yeah, we'll get to that in a bit. This is basically Stalin's life story in a nutshell. On one hand, we have the official Soviet account for his life, where he's this badass Russian mustachioed demigod who broke the chains of imperialism and rose to become a communist hero. On the other, we have the probably more accurate account of a nasty, pretty insecure Georgian kid with a sharp mind for politics and throwing others under the bus so he could be in charge. Of course, nobody pushed the first version of the story more than Joseph himself. In true Soviet fashion, the guy probably said, "Why let the truth get in the way of a good story?" But we'll see that old Joseph has a few skeletons in his closet. Metaphorical and literal, too. The man history remembers as Joseph Stalin was actually born Yosef Bessarionis Zay Chugashvili, which is a bit of a mouthful, so we'll stick with Joseph, though he'll go through names pretty quickly. He grew up in Gori, in central Georgia. Georgia was part of the Russian Empire, under the thumb of the absolute monarch, Tsar Nicholas II, but it still felt distinct from the main Russian bloc. Little Joseph didn't even speak Russian. His first language was Georgian, and he would only pick up Russian later in life after learning it at school. He was the son of Bessarion Jugashvili and Ekaterine Jaladze. Joseph was actually the couple's third son, but both of his older brothers died in infancy. His mother prayed every day and promised to make a pilgrimage if their third son survived. His dad was a cobbler and owned a pretty successful business, but it soon went bust, leaving Joseph to grow up in poverty. His dad became an alcoholic and started beating him severely. Joseph's mom decided this was no way to raise a child, so she took her son and jumped around a bit, living in many different places during his childhood. So little Joseph didn't have the best of childhoods, but things got even worse when he contracted smallpox as a kid, which left a permanent scar across his face. As if it wasn't bad enough, Joseph double-dipped for childhood trauma at the age of 12, when a speeding horse-drawn carriage hit him on the street, seriously injuring his arm. For the rest of his life, his left arm was considerably shorter than his right. A sickly, weakened child is far from the man of steel image that would develop later in Joseph's life. But that doesn't mean the kid didn't have some fight in him still. Joseph's mother, religious as ever, dreamed her son would one day become a priest, which might prove difficult considering he hated everything to do with religion. But hey, never say never. Joseph did well at school initially, showing plenty of promise, but became a bit of a bad boy in his later years. He started to take up bad habits, hang out with the wrong crowds, and his grades started to go down. Anytime he could stand against authority, he'd do so. Things in the Russian Empire weren't going so great, and there were a few guys in Europe and Russia who wrote about how it might be time for a change. A revolution, even. The Tsars banned revolutionary works, but that only made them more enticing to young Joseph. He'd sneak away when his teachers weren't looking and read all kinds of communist works. Joseph's grades slipped, but his knowledge of communist theory grew and grew, and he became more radicalized. The more time went on, the more he began to hate the Orthodox Church and all religion, becoming a rebel against authority, much to his mother's dismay. One book in particular caught his attention, the Communist Manifesto. Not exactly the kind of book you'd read to your kids as goodnight stories, but young Joseph took a liking to it and thought this Marx guy had a few good ideas. Another story Joseph was fond of was The Patricide, a story about a cunning Robin Hood type who Joseph really liked, so he took on the protagonist's name as a nom de guerre. Whenever he would sneak away to organize secret workers' meetings, the others would call him Koba rather than Joseph. Joseph didn't keep his antics to just the schoolyard either. When he took up his first job as a meteorologist in Tbilisi, Georgia's capital, he convinced his coworkers to take part in a big May Day strike. It wasn't long before the Russian imperial authorities started to take notice of this short, stocky, wild-haired rogue and his revolutionary shenanigans. He'd be like, "Guys, don't you think we should have better pay and, more holidays? And also maybe violently overthrow the entire government and shoot the Tsar?" Okay, that second one we could park for now, but better pay and holidays we're cool with, right? Joseph was kicked out of his new job for being too much of a brave, handsome rebel sticking up for his fellow workers. At least, that's how Joseph would later tell the story. The reality is that he probably left the capital because his mother was worried about his health. But that doesn't have the same panache, does it? And a guy like Joseph hated being seen as a weakling. Rather than go to therapy to deal with his insecurities like an adult, he decided to just flat out lie. Rather than the hard laborer man of steel picture you might imagine, young Joseph was actually more of a communist LARPer. He'd basically be the equivalent of an internet keyboard warrior in the modern day. But it's in the first few years of the 20th century that two aspects of Joseph's personality started to shine through: his charismatic side and his brutal side. In 1903, a certain man by the name of Vladimir Lenin had been kicking up a fuss in the Russian Empire. Lenin advocated for a workers' revolution and the discussion of the monarchy in favor of a state where the proletariat hold the means of production and power. Thousands joined his party, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, including Joseph. It was at one of the 1905 meetings in Finland that young Joseph met the communist superstar himself, Big L, Vladimir Lenin. Joseph would publicly say how much of a success the meeting was, that they were best buddies and super aligned on everything. But in private, Joseph thought Lenin was too timid, and Lenin thought Joseph was a bit dumb. But Lenin and Joseph weren't the only revolutionaries throwing their toys out of the pram and bickering between each other. Communist thought was becoming more and more popular, but not everybody agreed on how exactly this revolution and the communist utopia it was to bring in should be carried out. Some advocated for a slower, more liberal form of revolution that transitioned out of capitalism bit by bit. Others, like Joseph, saw things like parliamentary democracy as a waste of time. He wasn't afraid of getting his hands dirty. Filthy, in fact. Joseph was in Baku at the time, the capital of Azerbaijan. He started getting some seriously bad guys together without the authorities noticing. These were young thugs who were more than happy to deal out a few beatings, steal money, and even straight up murder political opponents if it suited them. Joseph organized and led battle squads throughout the city, who would go around intimidating people, beating up political rivals and police, and stealing money to fund the communists. He even went so far as to pull off a massive bank heist and kidnap the kids of wealthy people to hold them ransom. Joseph took no issue with using any methods he could to get what he wanted. The man had a vision, and he would make that vision a reality, even if it killed him, or if it killed anyone else. A few years later, the police finally found Joseph and threw him in prison. But even there, he rallied the other Bolsheviks to take out any other cellmates who snitched on the movement. Joseph had learned how to get people on his side, and was seen more as a full-on Marxist force of nature than a man by this point. It's also during this time that Joseph took on the alias of Stalin, meaning man of steel in Russian, to further reinforce his image as a communist titan. Now, a highly valuable asset to Lenin's cause and a man more than willing to do the dirty work behind the scenes, Joseph continued to organize strikes and violent protests against the Tsar, being exiled to Serbia over and over. But each time he came back with even more venom in his heart. Think of a cockroach that you try to stamp out, but every time you try, it comes back even more angry than the last time. That was Joseph to the government. When Russia entered the First World War, Joseph was called up to serve in the army, but he was deemed unfit because of his arm. In 1917, the February Revolution, which actually happened in March, because, hey, why not, toppled the monarchy, transforming the Russian Empire into a republic. Joseph, however, was still in exile, so didn't get to see much of it himself. You might think it would be party time, but even with the monarchy finally toppled, nobody could decide how to actually run the new state. The October Revolution, which took place in November, get it together guys, saw Joseph and the other Bolsheviks violently take control of the state and form the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the Soviet Union, for short. As a member of the governing Central Committee, Joseph got to work. Political opponents were shipped off, their institutions dismantled, and anyone who dared stand against the new order suddenly and mysteriously disappeared. The final nail in the coffin for the Russian Empire came when the Bolsheviks gave the order to put down Tsar Nicholas II. With next to no warning at all, the Russian emperor in custody was shot, and his whole family killed. Just like that, the last light of the Russian Empire was snuffed out. The USSR took its place. Joseph now had a front row seat next to his buddy Lenin at the top of Russian social hierarchy. More power didn't mellow Joseph out, however. Managing food procurement, he put entire villages to the torch to make sure they met quotas and cracked down on any descendants with brutal force. His violent methods made a lot of other Bolsheviks worry. What would this guy do if he had even more power than he does now, they thought. Turns out, they didn't have to wait long to find out. Lenin passed away in 1924. Joseph did a fantastic job of maneuvering himself to become his successor. He consolidated his supporters, talked smack about others behind their backs, and portrayed himself as Lenin's favorite student, the heir to the communist movement. After a series of purges and moves against his opponents in the party, Joseph cemented himself as the new supreme leader of the USSR. With this new power, he renamed cities after himself, the most famous one being Stalingrad, and began rewriting his history to create his new cult of personality. From then on, Joseph was gone. Stalin, the man of steel, had taken his place. Violence, cunning, and an unquenchable ambition made a little sickly Georgian boy into a steel tyrant, and one of the most brutal Soviet dictators of all time. But Stalin's biggest test lay right over the horizon.